Hey folks, another day, another video. Today we'll be working on the good old S4. As you can see over here, I've actually already gone ahead and raised the car up, done an oil change, the routine oil change. I've also gone ahead and installed a comfort adapter. I don't know if you can see it blinking over there. Let me zoom in. So that I can actually charge the car more easily on the seat electrical charger that I have installed over there as well. So that's the reason why I actually have the hood open. You don't need to do that for the actual exercise at hand today, which is a brake change. That includes the brake caliper as well as the brake rotor. Now on this particular car, it's shy of 50,000 miles. I actually am still on the original brake pads and brake rotors. I actually went in for a routine service roughly about, I think, 4 or 5 months ago. And at that point in time, the shop mentioned that I would have to change my pads in roughly about 6 months or so. I don't have the indicator on my dash on. Usually, as you can see over here, this little cable. So this is the pad wear sensor, and it actually shows a little yellow light on your dash if and when the pad is supposed to be replaced. I don't have that on, but again, it's close to 9 years at this point in time, close to 50,000 miles. I'm really bored. There's not a whole lot that we can do right now, given everything else that's going on in the world. So I thought I already have all the parts, as you can see. So I just thought I'll put together this video for a fun little weekend project. So yes, so we'll be doing the front brake pads as well as the front brake rotors. And we'll be doing the rear brake pads as well as the rotors. Now, in the interest of keeping the video relatively short, I'll actually be splitting up the front rotor change and the rear rotor change into two different videos so that it'll be easily accessible for you folks, depending on which side, the front or the back, that you want to change yourself. As well as searching for the parts and whatnot. I'll actually be putting all the part numbers down in the description. So 3 things to actually keep in mind. The first, make sure that you loosen I've already removed the wheels, as you can see. Make sure that you loosen the lug nuts for the wheels while the car is still on the ground. It just makes the process infinitely easier. That's point number 1. Point number 2, please make sure that you have all the tools available to you, easily accessible. I'll call out each of the tools as we use them, and I'll see if I can actually put the list in the description as well as all the parts and whatnot. And the third thing is you want to make sure that depending upon the side that you want to work on first, you turn the steering wheel in the appropriate direction so that you have more room to utilize while actually getting your hands behind over there, because you're going to have to do that quite a bit. Actually, one more thing, you may have already seen this in a couple of different videos and whatnot. You want to make sure that once the caliper as well as the carrier assembly is taken out, you don't leave it dangling or hanging by the brake line. That's a recipe for disaster. So different folks recommend different ways of getting around that. Some folks actually tie a zip tie to this and actually hang it off of the mount over here. Some folks actually leave it on a bucket. That's the approach that I'll be trying to use today. And actually, this is actually the second time that I'm doing a brake change. The first was a few years ago, actually many years ago, on my Mark 5 Jetta. Very similar to an oil change. This actually isn't rocket science. Between an oil change and a brake pad and brake rotor change, you should actually be able to do this with some help here and there and fairly basic tools, as you can see. There will be a question that a lot of folks end up asking, which is, do I need to do the pads as well as the rotors at the same time? And the answer, unfortunately, is not universal. It's going to be dependent on your specific case. In my case, again, as I mentioned, my car at this point in time is on its original rotors and pads, and it's roughly 9 years old. So I actually feel like it's not terribly bad, but based on the recommendation, given that the pads are so old, I'm actually going to go ahead and change the rotor as well as the pads together. If on the other hand, your pads are much worse off than your rotors, either because you're a very aggressive driver or you have to do a lot of stop and go traffic, definitely inspect the rotors. You want to make sure that there is no lipping or very obvious wear on them, but you can go ahead and do just the brake pads. And same for track use, where very likely you'll end up going through multiple pads for each set of rotors. So again, just do some basic inspection, and unless you have obvious cupping or lipping, in which case you'll have no choice, just go ahead and do the pads alone. As I mentioned, I will be splitting the front and the rears into two different videos, because the front is actually quite a bit simpler. Not that the rear is complicated, but the front is simpler, because for the rear I'll be making use of the vacuum tool in order to retract the electronic parking brake. This is actually new for me. I did not have an electronic parking brake on my Mark 5 Jetta, so that was actually a fairly straightforward process for the rear as well. So let's see how it ends up going. So we'll be working on the front in three phases. One is removing the actual caliper with the pads. The second is actually removing the carrier that you see over here. And the third would be to remove the rotor. So that's how we'll be approaching this process, which is do everything that's needed to get rid of the actual caliper, removing this clip that you see over here. And you'll actually see two bolts. I'll move the camera behind. There'll be two bolts, one at the top, one at the bottom. And I think there are 13mm bolts. I'll confirm that and put that on screen. And then once we get rid of that, we'll actually have to remove the wear sensor. Then we move on to removing the carrier that you see over here, the silver looking part. And once that entire assembly is out, that's when we'll actually go ahead and remove the rotor. So let's get started with that. Okay, step one is actually removing this retaining clip that you see over here. The easiest method, and I would say the least destructive method, would actually be to use a C-clamp to essentially apply force on the actual clip that you see over here. So it pushes this in the other direction. That actually loosens some tension over here. And you can use another tool, such as what I have over here, to essentially move this out and unclip it as you apply more and more force in the direction of the clip to remove tension from here. I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but this car obviously, as you know, has essentially been in California its entire life. We've definitely taken it on road trips and whatnot through snow and ice and all that fun stuff. But predominantly the car has been in California and relatively dry weather. As a result, rust, again, you can see that on the hub, but that is inevitable. But for the most part, the screws and whatnot should not have a whole lot of rust. In fact, in getting those bolts out, I had to expend very little effort. But that being said, if your car is in fact in a snowy region that's prone to dust because of road salts and whatnot, make sure you have something like this. I have the PB blaster here handy with you before you do this work, because the last thing that you want happening is once you actually start all the work, you're stuck because a particular bolt or nut or screw doesn't come out since it's just lodged in place. So having something like PB blaster, as well as what I have over here, it's called an impact driver set. Comes in handy when you're working with brakes and wheels and whatnot, essentially stuff that you don't end up removing very often, and therefore because of rust and build up and whatnot, they tend to be set in place. All right, the next thing that we want to do is get rid of this brake pad wear sensor. Relatively straightforward. Just yank it out towards you in this direction, nudge it back and forth a little bit, and it should come out relatively easily. The reason why you want to get rid of this is because, again, it's a relatively small short wire, and you don't want this to get kinked or yanked in any way while we are working on pulling this assembly, the carrier and the caliper assembly out. And so from here, you need to disconnect it from the back. So just basically trace this wire all the way back, and you'll see this little notch over here. The idea here is to actually insert a screwdriver or something similar to a screwdriver in over there, release the particular notch that you see on top, and in doing so you're freeing the latch mechanism, so to speak. And once that has been freed, you want to ensure that you're able to rotate this in a clockwise or counterclockwise direction and then pull it down. It's very, very simple. You can actually see it over there. Okay, once you have removed the clamp, the next thing you want to do is loosen this bolt over here, as well as this bolt at the bottom over here. They're actually 13mm bolts, so use a 13mm socket to get rid of this one as well as this one. Connected the sensor cable as well as the two 13mm bolts that you see on the back. It's time for us to actually remove the caliper assembly. There are a couple of different ways of doing this. Honestly speaking, again, if your pad is not worn out much, well, in that case you shouldn't be swapping your brakes out. But if they actually have more life than they than that's needed to replace them, and for whatever reason you do want to replace them, you actually first have to figure a way to compress the piston, the caliper piston, because that ends up having quite a bit of tension in it. In my particular case, and as will be the case for most of you guys swapping your pads out, your pads have worn out or they're very close to wearing out. In this particular case, what you do is I'm going to use the relatively straightforward flathead screwdriver / similar tool method. You see the notches here and a similar notch at the bottom over here. What you want to do is just use a piece of cloth to ensure that you don't scratch it, obviously, but through the cloth you want to ensure that you put the flathead screwdriver in there, nudge it in there, and actually yank at it slightly. You will see the pad or the caliper move slightly. I don't know if you guys could see that, but there you go, it's moved slightly. And I'll actually move it back to show you the level of movement. You see that? So you actually want to press on this to push it towards you slightly, and then you do the same thing at the bottom. You go back and forth, maybe about 3, 4, 5 times, and sooner or later this will actually pull out. Okay, so once you've sort of gone back and forth between the top and the bottom, and again, it's very, very important that you do it in stages. Don't apply too much force just in one direction without kind of freeing it up at the bottom. So apply a little force at the top, then the bottom, alternate back and forth. Once you do this enough number of times, the last 10% would require a little bit more force, wherein you basically put the screwdriver in, push against the brake rotor, and once you do that, you will actually see that this yanks out relatively straightforward, as is the case over here. Now again, it's very, very important to make sure I'm holding the the caliper, but do not leave it dangling. You need to ensure that you actually have it either on a zip tie or on the bucket at the bottom. Okay, so now that we've removed the caliper assembly, and I actually had to swap my bucket out because the car is on quick jacks. It's quite a bit raised from the ground, so the other bucket didn't work. So I had to use a taller bucket and another box to make sure that the caliper assembly is resting comfortably. But once you've removed this, you can actually see that one of the pads comes out super quick. This is the pad that is actually on the inside of the rotor here, right here. The other one is actually going to require a little bit more effort prying. You're going to have to use a flathead screwdriver, and the reason for that is, if I'm not mistaken, the OEM pads, the way they come from the factory, they're actually glued on the side. Case I actually tried prying or using a flathead screwdriver through the notch here and here quite a bit. I could actually see it move slightly. I could even see the glue kind of like, trying to relax, but then it didn't work out very well for me. So I had to take a slightly more brute force approach. So I ended up using a hammer and essentially knocking on this tab over here about 3-4 times, good solid blows. And sure enough, with that, the other pad ended up freeing itself. So now that we've gotten the caliper assembly removed as well as the pads, as I mentioned, stage 2 is to actually remove the carrier assembly that you see over here. And these are actually held together by two 21mm bolts. The first one that you see is over here on the top, and then at the bottom you have another similar 21mm bolt over here. So once you're actually able to unscrew both these bolts, the one on top and at the bottom, this carrier assembly should then be coming off fairly easily. Okay, so quick update. So in my particular case, I couldn't get the 21 mm bolt up top and the one at the bottom free using a regular wrench. I actually ended up having to use a breaker bar to get those bolts free, even though there is no visible, actually there's no obvious signs of rusting at all. So I think it's just because of carbon buildup as well as heat cycling over, close to a decade. They were set in place. So don't be shy to use a breaker bar. And once I actually use the breaker bar to set the thing free, it's now rotating fairly straightforward. So just make sure that give it an honest shot with a wrench. If it doesn't work, just use a breaker bar to break it loose and then use a wrench to continue forward. Okay, so once you're done removing these two massive 21 mm bolts, the carrier assembly that you see down over there should actually slide out very, very easily. And once you're done with the carrier assembly, we then end up moving to stage 3 of the disassembly process, which is to remove the rotor. And believe it or not, the only thing that's really holding this rotor in place is essentially this one set screw or a locking screw. It's a T27, a Torx 27 type. And in my particular case, it actually came out trivially easily. I mean, I didn't even have to extend a whole lot of force to get the screw out. But in your case, you may have to. And again, that's where I mentioned having something like the PB blaster or an impact driver set will actually be very, very handy. So once you're actually done with removing the set screw or the locking screw, it's just a matter of yanking this rotor out. Okay, so as I'd imagined, this was the hardest part of the process. My non-violent approach of using the rubber mallet did not work the first get-go. So I actually ended up having to use some PB blaster through all of these holes over here, as well as the circumference of the hub that you see. Let it sit for, I don't know, like maybe like 3 minutes or so, I guess. Then I actually used a standard hammer. I actually hit on the exactly where the screw holes were first. Nice solid blows. You could actually see a lot of dust sort of come out, and it still wouldn't budge. And then I actually took the rubber mallet and I had at it at the actual rotor surface. Okay, so now that we have the entire brake assembly out, which includes the rotor, the actual caliper, the carrier, the pads, everything, we essentially have to go in the the reverse process, which is put everything back right now. So I just have the old and the new brake pads in front of me, and you can actually very clearly see the difference in the thickness. And in fact, it's now I realize that you can actually start seeing, I don't know if it's visible in the camera, there you go, the metal backing kind of like shining through. So I'm a little bit surprised that the brake sensor, the brake pad wear sensor didn't go off, because it actually seems to be on its very last leg. Maybe another month or so and it would have gone off. But nevertheless, you can see the distinct sort of difference in the thickness between a brand new brake pad and an old one. And even more importantly, actually, when I opened up the new box of brake pads, I just realized they actually come with a new pad sensor. So you don't need to reuse the old one. So you can actually go ahead and disconnect and yank the old one out. And more interestingly, the box, again, this is an OEM set of brake pads. They actually come with new carrier bolts as well. So that's another interesting thing. I don't need to reuse the old bolts, and I maybe understand why, because there's like a Loctite kind of a material coated on these on the treads. So essentially, I think they don't want you to reuse the bolts all over again. So just something to keep in mind. If you get the OEM set of the rotors and pads and whatnot, everything comes in the box. If not, maybe you want to order the carrier bolts separately. Okay, so here is my brand new rotor. I bought this from Deutsche Auto Parts Shop DAP. I highly encourage you to actually look around. So what I ended up doing, if I'm not mistaken, and I bought this a while ago, so I could be off by a little bit, I actually ended up getting the rear rotors and I think a couple of other items from ECS, while I got the front rotors and I think the pads, the rear pads, some weird combination like that from Shop DAP, because there was a difference of about, like, I think 40-50 bucks or so. And again, I'm not a sponsored channel, so all of this comes out of my pocket. So I want to ensure that I actually get the best bang for the buck, so to speak. So there are a bunch of different places: FCP Euro, ECS Tuning, Shop DAP. So find the one that works the best for you. But in my particular case, I ended up going with OEM pads as well as OEM rotors. Here is the actual part number. Don't worry, you don't have to make note of it. It will be somewhere in the description, or I'll put it at the beginning of the video. But nevertheless, as you can see here, that is the hole through which you'll actually use the set screw or the lock screw to hold the rotor to the hub. Then you go back and put the carrier assembly, again using those the extra nuts that they've given you, that holds the carrier assembly in place. And then you mount the caliper onto the carrier assembly using the 13mm sockets, and yeah, you're essentially good to go. I'll do one more short clip once I've actually put everything in place, just doing a sort of 30-second summary of the steps that needs to be followed to essentially put everything back together. See you in a bit. Quick note, as I had suspected, Audi does in fact use an adhesive material, a backing material, which you obviously need to remove before you put it back into the actual caliper carrier. So something to keep in mind, do not use any kind of anti-squeal, anti-squeak compound, because either this particular padding already does that job, or even if it does not, for whatever reason, Audi wants to ensure that the particular brake pads are set in place and held in place not just by the screws but also by the adhesive backing. So please ensure that you do not put any kind of anti-squeal or anti-squeak glue or whatever liquid on the back. Definitely not on the pad surface for obvious reasons, and definitely don't use anti-seize on these as well. It's okay to use them on the hub to ensure that you don't have the same sort of problem getting the rotor out the next time, but do not use it on the actual brake pad assembly itself. That won't end well. Okay, so before you put the brake pads back, one thing to note is that use a C-clamp very carefully to essentially compress the piston as much as you can, because you saw the difference in the width between the new pad and the old pad. So you want to ensure that when you put the new pad in, there is actually enough clearance for the rotor to slot right in between. And to do that, you need to ensure that the actual piston is pushed back in as much. Be very careful in clamping on the actual metal surface, not the rubber bushing. You don't want to tear this, otherwise you'll have to swap the entire assembly out. So use a C-clamp essentially along the edges here to try and compress the piston in as much as possible, and then go ahead and use the brake pad with the backing, the adhesive backing. Remove the tape obviously and stick that in place, aligning it with these screws and the divot in the middle. And likewise on the other end, you want to ensure that the pad with the actual sensor is essentially on this side, with the sensor cable going in through that outlet or the opening over there, coming back out. You actually have the bleeder screw over here with an opening. You want the wire to go in, and then you close the bleeder screw cap. You have it come out this way and essentially connect to the I don't see the cable here, there you go, that socket at the bottom. So essentially just repeat the process in reverse that you use to essentially remove this entire assembly out, and yeah, you should be good to go. Okay, all right guys, so I actually wrapped up the other side as well. Again, it's the exact same process as the driver's side, with the only difference being the fact that you don't have the pad wear sensor to deal with. So it saves you about 5 minutes or so. So I timed myself, including the little beer break. This took roughly about, I think, 45 to 50 minutes or so. And I'm sure if I do this more often, you can start shaving off another 5-10 minutes. So honestly speaking, again, as I mentioned, between the oil change, between the brake pad and rotor change, wiper change and stuff like that, you've nailed almost all the consumables. Obviously the tires are the biggest consumable, one of the biggest consumables, but you can't really do that at home. You require very specialized equipment and a lot of space and room and stuff like that for it. But honestly speaking, between the oil filter and the oil, the brake rotors and the brake pads, the wipers and other miscellaneous stuff, fluids, you've basically nailed like 80% of your vehicle's lifetime worth of consumables. DIY, all DIY. Not super hard at all, the brakes. I really like working on the S4. It's nothing too complicated, especially when you compare it to the RS3, which I don't know if you've seen my videos on that. Again, it's a nice car, but everything is very, very specialized. The tolerances are much tighter. It's a lot less room to work on that thing. It's just a lot more challenging. Again, I'm talking about it relatively speaking. You'll see another car here. Hang tight, there'll be another video upcoming, and I'm sure this one is a lot more of a pain to work with than the RS3. So anyway, net the brakes are done. The one very important thing though, again, actually two important things. One, jack the since the car is jacked, make sure that the wheel lugs are tightened to the best of your abilities. But once the jack is actually lowered, you're going to have to tighten it to the torque spec, the full spec. Something to keep in mind. The second, and this is very, very, very important, so please do not forget this. After you have swapped the rotors and the pads and everything else, remember we had to compress the piston because we had to make room for the thicker pads versus the original ones or the older ones that were there. So in the process of doing that, the pistons are still in those relaxed, in that relaxed state. So it is extremely important that you pump the brakes at least about 7 to 8 times to ensure that the brake is completely leveled and the pistons are in the right position. I have actually heard where even very seasoned folks forget to do this, and especially if you do all 4 tires, if you don't pump the brakes, you will desperately and furiously be trying to stomp on the brakes, but then there isn't enough pressure that's built up, and as a result you may actually run into something. So that's very, very important. Prime the brake lines and the piston by pumping the brakes about 8 to 10 times, and yeah, you should be good. So the next video, again, as I mentioned, will be on the rear end. I have never done a rear end with the electronic parking brake. I have a VACCOM, so I'll be using the VACCOM to release the electronic parking brake, but I sincerely hope this is an easier process than the front. Not that the front was hard, but if it's easier, it's better, I guess. So with that, I'll actually catch you in another video. And again, if you like these videos, please subscribe, like and share. Not because I want advertisers or any of those things. It's just that I have ideas for other videos which require me to kind of maybe collaborate or reach out to certain folks or companies, and unfortunately it's all about quantity and not quality, and by that I mean the subscriber count matters. So if you can help kind of keep that subscriber count growing, that will actually help me try and bring more such videos in my spare time to you guys. So with that, thank you, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.